In this next section, what I want to do is discuss a transition from earlier periods to later periods, and what I'm kind of suggesting, my main thesis is that as we get closer and closer to the 1300s, you're going to start seeing much more naturalism, and it's really the beginning of the Renaissance, which is a rebirth of the classicism that we saw from ancient Rome and Greece. So we're going to start first with the Pisa Baptistry, which is a Gothic / Romanesque structure, and it has in the interior of it a pulpit made by a guy named Nicola Pisano, who I think he was named after the city of Pisa, and that's where his name comes from. He and his father and his family actually were artists who worked on various projects around Pisa. And what we're looking at is a pulpit, which would be in the center of the baptistry, and is basically a platform in which a priest can stand up there and deliver a sermon. And if you look at the pulpit itself, it looks a little bit Gothic. You see some Gothic tracery on it, but you can also see some clearly classical references. The Corinthian columns with the lions underneath it are actually, the lions are sort of Byzantine in nature, but then we have these Corinthian columns. Then you have the Gothic tracery above it. Then you have these panels that depict scenes that are important religious scenes to the Catholic faith. I was at a museum, I think in Pennsylvania, and they had a room of plaster reproductions of some of these things, and I was delighted to see that they had actually a plaster pulpit that, you know, you don't have to fly to Italy, I guess, to see it. And I asked my friend Eric to stand in front of it so you got a sense of its scale. If you look at the panel that's right above his head, that's actually the panel that we're going to be studying by Nicola Pisano. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is actually the iconography and the construction of the picture in terms of where the symbols all lay. And you may remember some of these things that we've seen before from looking at the stained glass window in the last lecture. So in the upper left-hand corner, and I'll point at it for you so you can see it a little bit better, we see Gabriel here, and he is gesturing towards Mary. And this scene is actually an annunciation scene in which the angel Gabriel is coming and announcing to Mary. And she is slightly recoiling away because this is an honor, but it's also a little bit scary. And so we're starting to see a little bit of a human gesture. Beneath them, in the lower left-hand corner, is Joseph. And Joseph, remember I mentioned to you that he is this character who's they don't really know what to do with him because he's not really the father of Jesus. He's basically kind of a stepfather in a way. But he's still Saint Joseph, and so we include him in this picture. Then if you move a little bit to the right, you'll see there's a creche scene or a nativity scene in which Jesus is in a basket. Mary is reclining, and this also looks almost exactly like the stained glass window that we saw. And in the upper right-hand corner, and they are missing their heads, are the three magi. And the three magi are coming in and delivering gifts to the baby Jesus. Then in the center of the scene we see here, Jesus has his head knocked off, and Mary is missing her arm. It's actually a baptism scene. They're washing the infant Jesus in this sort of chalice or vessel. In the lower right-hand corner, we actually have a scene of it's a manger scene, but it also references, probably in a sort of typological way, the story of David and David being a good shepherd, and this is the birth of David. So we have all of the main elements in a continuous narrative, and a continuous narrative is all the, like 3 or 4 stories can be told in the same picture plane. And all of these stories are told in a way that's very similar to the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, also very similar to the stained glass window we looked at, and also have some other historical precedents or antecedents. So what I'd like to do next is talk about this from a formal point of view. Now, from a formal point of view, I want you to notice that there really is no creation of normal space in this. We do have a little size scale difference. For instance, we have Gabriel and Mary, and then there's a building behind them that's a little smaller. We also have the 3 wise men in the background who are a little bit smaller. So the things in the foreground are larger than the things in the background. So there's a little bit of a creation of space, but then we have this enormous Mary reclining here. And this enormous Mary is basically, she's in the center of the picture to call attention to her role as being very important. The next thing that I think is very important is also the way that it is sculpted is much more naturalistic than we're used to seeing. And this is around 1260. And so we're starting to see in at least Pisa that they're returning a little bit to the old Roman way of carving things that's very naturalistic. The drapery is not necessarily completely wet drapery, but it still shows the form underneath. And it looks like a classical sculpture. Even the faces are less Byzantine in nature. They look a little bit more like old Greco-Roman sculptures that we've studied earlier in this class. Some of the ideas that are important and will lead you to be able to study the Renaissance are how space is created in images. So I've included a diagram here beneath the pulpit of Pisa for you to sort of compare and contrast some of the things too. Now, what I want to point out is that there isn't enough architecture in here to see that there isn't true what's called linear perspective, 1 and 2 point perspective. But you're going to have to take me at my word until they don't use linear perspective until probably around the 1380s or 1400s that it doesn't come up. However, we are starting to see some things overlapping is starting to create space. We also have sizes diminishing in the background. And generally, a rule of thumb is that anything that is higher up in the picture plane usually is in the background, so we have a vertical perspective. We also have diagonal perspective, where things that are lower down and in the foreground, lower in the picture plane, generally are in the foreground, and that things diagonally back are in the background. And of course, since this is a sculpture, we won't be studying atmospheric perspective with it. So I have some images up here that I think will help us to understand the traditions that these things come out of. And we've got a Byzantine / early Christian Psalter, which is basically a songbook of David composing the Psalms. And if you look at this image, you'll see that the drapery that Mary is wearing in Pisano's pulpit is actually kind of similar a little bit to the drapery that we see in this early Byzantine thing. We also have a little bit of the same kind of poses, for instance, in the foreground. And then in the lower right-hand corner of this Psalter, we see a scene that is actually a manger scene. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that there were probably tons of images that has similar kind of composition, even though this is David composing music, that the way that it's arranged is very similar to how the pulpit from Pisa's baptistry is constructed, and that this is the schema on the left-hand side, and this is the correction. Now, I don't know if he necessarily saw this one specifically, but I'm sure that there were tons of copies that were similar because they were constantly sort of borrowing from each other at this point in time. And then the next thing that I wanted to show you is that we have this, the three goddesses from the Pediment of the Parthenon from about 450 BCE, and it shows this reclining goddess figure that is strikingly similar to the reclining figure of Mary. And so probably the Parthenon is the schema for all the Byzantine stuff. And then we have this sort of continuous thread running where we have a tradition and then an innovation on it. And it's almost like we're coming back full circle to the wet drapery style and to these reclining female figures that are wearing this kind of garment. The last thing that I wanted to point out or show you is this painting by Duccio. And this panel by Duccio is really a sort of distillation or a copying of some of the main pictorial elements that we see in the baptistry pulpit from Pisa. So for instance, you see the same pose that Mary is seated in. We have Joseph in the lower left-hand corner. We even have these figures of Mary and her maid actually washing the infant Jesus in a bowl that's very similar to the bowl. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have the same kinds of elements with the manger scene and these animals. And surrounding it are a host of angels, which is a slight difference in the construction of it. And in the right-hand side, we have the three wise men coming in. So again, This is 1308 to 1311. It's actually contemporary with Cimabue and Giotto that we're going to be studying later on. And we've got the same kinds of schema, the same kinds of imagery in both of these panels, in the relief sculpture and also in the tempera painted panel by Duccio. So we're going to continue on with these transitions that I was talking about and talk a little bit about the imagery that comes from Pisano and how it evolves from the Romanesque style. And so one of the things that I wanted to point out is a pretty important work of art is this Virgin and Child from the French, in the French Romanesque style. And we are looking at her, and she's in a very Byzantine kind of drapery style, and the theme again is the throne of wisdom that we had discussed earlier. And we can see that the drapery is extremely unrealistic. The figures are kind of disproportionate, and they're very stiff and unlifelike. And within a fairly short period of time, about 100 years or so, we actually have this sort of explosion by Pisano in which he creates something that looks almost classic in style. And so again, I want to trace this sort of evolution of realism and naturalism in art that really starts taking off in the last half of the 1200s in Italy and really gets going in the 1300s. One of the things that we had discussed somewhat in depth before were the ideas of one of the things that we had discussed somewhat in depth before were the ideas of schema and correction, meaning that there's an original plan or original schema and then an updated version. And we looked at this painting by Cimabue, who is a Florentine painter. And he paints really in a very Byzantine way, even though he's Italian, and he's working around 1280 to 1300 to 1310. And what I tell my students to memorize the date is 1300, and I actually tell them that this is when the artwork in Italy goes through its bar mitzvah. It makes a transition and becomes a little bit more realistic. So Cimabue was Giotto's teacher, and Giotto is represented on the right-hand side here. And Cimabue is in keeping with the old styles that we just saw. We saw that French Romanesque sculpture that shows the Virgin enthroned with the child on her lap. And in this instance, we have Cimabue's Virgin Mary gesturing towards Jesus. And it is fairly unrealistic compared to the sculpture on the right-hand side, or the painting on the right-hand side. Giotto is considered basically the special effects man of the 1300s who changes everything from this point forward. And so we need to do a compare and contrast to see what makes Giotto so fancy. Now, I have some readings that I have assigned you guys in my textbook, but just to summarize, there was a biographer by the name of Vasari who actually talks about the life and times of Cimabue and Giotto. He's a much later biographer, and he wants to document the coming of the Renaissance, the Rinascimento that happened at this point in time. And what he does is he describes actually the interrelationship of Cimabue's art to Giotto's art, and Cimabue comes across Giotto. He's actually a shepherd, and he's drawing, and Cimabue thinks that Giotto is just the cat's meow and takes him on as an apprentice. And he becomes a painter for Cimabue, working in his studio. And then Giotto sort of surpasses him. And there's a couple of episodes or stories that you can look up about Giotto drawing a perfect sphere in order to get a commission, and also another story about Giotto actually drawing a fly so realistically that his teacher Cimabue tried to swat it away off of his drawing paper. And all of these things are probably legendary and not real, but they go to the idea that in Italy, especially in the 14 and 1500s, they looked at Giotto as if he was like this genius, this giant of painting. And for us, these two things look very, very similar, but they're actually really not. So let's take a closer look at these paintings and see what we can talk about them. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the Cimabue and open it up in another window so we can look at it a little bit more closely. And what I'd like to do is actually really zoom in on her face. and we'll scroll down the body a little bit. So the first thing that I want you to see is that it's done in a typical Byzantine fashion. The nose is very long, the eyes are up in the forehead. The drapery is really unrealistic. It's actually very cartoon-like. There's a lot of lines and diagrams in it that sort of show the direction that the drapery is moving. The architecture of the throne she's seated on doesn't make sense. And those angels are all almost like little clones, and they're not really expressing any kind of feeling, and they're not really looking at anything, except for maybe one or two of them are looking away. The figure of Jesus actually looks like a miniature adult, and he's seated on her lap as the throne. And I think a kind of funny or comic element to this is, look how long her shin would have to be in order to support Jesus on her lap. So I think that might be sort of an inconsistency, and we can tell that Cimabue is not really observing things very closely. Then the figures who are sort of the caryatid figures and the foundational figures of the church are actually very unrealistic and painted in a Byzantine fashion as well. Now, if we compare this against Giotto, what I'd like to do is actually take a look at this picture and look at it also a little bit more closely and analyze it in the same way and see how it's different and better than Cimabue's. We can see first, if we start at the top, her face is a little bit more realistic. I mean, for us it's a little creepy looking, but she is more realistic. We also see that the throne that she's seated on here is a sort of apsoidal shape. It has a little bit of shadow. And I think what throws some people off when they're looking at it is this is a halo around her head of flat gold leaf, and a halo of flat gold leaf halo around his head as well. So we have this figure that's a little bit, the anatomy of the face is a little bit more realistic. He still kind of looks a little bit like an adult who is miniature or miniaturized, but the anatomy is still slightly better, and we can actually see through her gown, and we can see her breasts, and we can see his genitals. And the reasons for this are actually to show that Giotto is actually a real, Jesus was a real person, and that Mary was a real person, and that they were actually, had the choice between the carnal or physical world and the spiritual, and that Jesus traded the better, more Platonic world. The other thing about showing Mary's breasts is the breasts are considered a symbol of charity and also of nourishment. And there's actually a story from ancient Rome about a daughter who breastfeeds her father, who is jailed wrongly in prison. And then, if you remember, at the end of The Grapes of Wrath, there's actually a scene in which there's a young woman who is feeding an old man who's starving to death in the book. So that's kind of a standard kind of symbol. The next thing that I want you to see is that to the left and the right, the throne makes so much sense that there are actually figures looking through the throne at the central figure of Jesus and Mary. And we can actually see also that these figures are literally looking at her. They are not actually looking off in different directions like we saw in Cimabue's painting. If we move down the figure and we start looking a little bit more closely at some things, the other thing that I want you to see is the drapery. The drapery is extremely realistic and painted in a way that shows volume, and it's almost wet drapery because we can see the figures and the forms underneath it. Now, the other thing that I want to point out to you, and I guess I should zoom out a little bit. If you look at this painting, it actually is very volumetric, meaning that there is a light source in the upper right-hand corner that rakes across the figures, and the shadow is on the left side of all of the figures, and it kind of unifies the whole picture and makes it seem as if there's a light source and that it's more naturalistic. So if you were to compare these two paintings, one of the things that you'll start seeing is Giotto uses light and shadow, and the Italian word for this is called chiaroscuro, and we're going to look at a diagram that talks about this a little bit more. And the light is coming from the upper right-hand corner and coming across it on the left. In Cimabue's, there's no light source. We can't figure out where the light is coming from. It's sort of almost like a driver's license or a fluorescent light. The other thing is that the gesture or humanistic gesture that we see in Giotto's, where these figures are all turning and regarding Mary, is significant, that they're actually referring to her and that there's an interaction of these figures. And they are overlapping in a rational way in Giotto's, where they actually kind of cover or obfuscate the figures behind them. Whereas in Cimabue's, we don't have that at all. We've got these sort of figures that are almost like on ladders or bleachers on. The drapery is much more realistic in Giotto's. The architecture is much more realistic in Giotto's. And we even have anatomy that makes more sense. Now, where they are both very similar is the actual composition, where Mary is larger than every other character there, and she's in the center of the picture plane. The sort of miniature adult Jesus baby kind of thing is also there. They also all have halos. But we have in Cimabue's, he's sort of the schema, and then we have Giotto being the correction. Some of the ideas that are going to be important for you to know, especially if you go on to study Renaissance art, is that there's something called chiaroscuro, which is literally a passage of light and shadow that moves across figures. And we have this sphere here, and it shows the main components of chiaroscuro. And what Giotto does is he has a couple of these things. He has the highlight, he has some transitions, and he kind of has a core, but he doesn't have reflected light at all. And we also don't really see cast shadow in Giotto's paintings. So later on in the 1400s, we're going to see that they have a real mastery of this light and shadow. And in the 1300s, Giotto's a groundbreaker. He starts doing some of these things. Now, what I'd also like to do is take a look at how paintings were made and the quality of painting, especially with the kinds of mediums that they're using. Now, what I have here is a distant shot or a general shot of Cimabue's crucifix, and it's painted with a paint called tempera, which is basically egg yolk mixed in with some ground up mineral pigments and then applied in little streaks. And you can see how streaky it is in the right hand, the detail shot of this. And so it's very hard to get light and shadow and to build up details. And what Giotto did in order to do this is he actually uses a series of crisscross hatch marks or diagonal and vertical lines to build up the surface of his painting. And so egg tempera is really a tough medium to kind of get light and shadow in, and Giotto does that pretty convincingly. But Cimabue is doing it almost like a cartoon, where he's like sort of cross contouring and following the edges of things, and it looks very streaky and cartoon-like. The other thing that I want you to notice is that Cimabue, if you look at the halo behind him, there is it's gold leaf, which is basically a panel made out of an antique wood, which would be something like an old piece of furniture that would be very hard and have no longer have moisture or gases in it. And they would coat it with a coating called gesso, which is calcium carbonate, which is marble dust, on this petrified wood, and then they would glue gold leaf to that, and then they would do designs in the gold leaf, which is called punch work, and we can see that in the detail in the background. It's almost like the punch work that you see on fancy shoes, wingtip shoes, and things like that. So panel painting is primary and is very important in the world at this point in time, especially in Italy. And they have really stopped a lot of major building projects, and part of this probably has to do with the economics of the Renaissance, and so we can talk about that a little bit. Now, what I'd like to talk about in terms of this, and I think it's important for you guys to know because it also expresses the relationship between Cimabue and Giotto, is that in the late Gothic period in Italy, probably between 1200 and 1300, there were a series of historical figures that really tie in with some of the things that, some of the artistic innovations. And so the first thing that you need to know is that the world of trade as we know it has been pushed back from Byzantium and into Europe again. And so the center of the sort of trading routes in Europe would be Italy. And a lot of trade is going through Italy, and you have the rise of a class of people who are fairly wealthy, who are almost commodities exchangers. So what you might have is someone who sails a boat in from Byzantium or from Egypt or some other place and is bringing spices or silk, and you'll have an Italian merchant who buys it, and then this Italian merchant decides that he's going to sell it to the French and the German for double or triple the price that he bought it for, and in doing so he makes a profit, and he becomes very important. So if you're a rich person, you become important. Some of the things that you do is you start educating your children. You send them to schools, and you also make sure that they know math and science really well. You also will be familiar with other cultures, and you'll also be so wealthy that you'll be kind of self-important. And so instead of this sort of communal aspect of building Gothic cathedrals and churches, these rich people would often order works of art either for their own private use as a private altar, but also sometimes to dedicate them to the church. And so the altars that we looked at by Giotto and Cimabue tie in with this. And so in order to order a work of art, you would have a system in which you have a patron, who is basically the rich merchant, and an apprentice and a guild member who would be the person who made the work of art. And the Guild of St. Luke, which was the major source of patronage at this point in time, who would allow artists to work in cities. Let's say Lorenzo de' Medici, for sake of argument, or Enrico Scrovegni comes to Giotto and wants to get a painting. Well, the first thing he'd have to do is work through the guild, and he would go to the guild, and the guild would recommend Giotto as the painter. Now, Enrico Scrovegni would want to have something that would be made in his lifetime immediately, and he could see it be developed, and so an altarpiece or a very decorations for a small church would be great, but he wouldn't want to build a major church. So then he hires Giotto, and Giotto actually charges him literally by the head. Like if there are 5 or 6 angels in it, you charge an extra $100 a head, let's say. The gold leaf actually costs extra. So if you're a merchant and you're going, I want a virgin and child enthroned, and then Giotto comes in, and it's sort of like when they try to sell you extra things for a car, you end up buying extra angels. For instance, blue is made out of lapis lazuli, so that'd be very expensive. And then you even charge for the wood that this is being made on, because you need a piece of antique wood that actually no longer has moisture in it. And then you make this work of art on this thing, and there's a procession in which they bring it to the church. So you can see that the system for ordering this kind of artwork would be very complex, and a lot of it has to do with showing how important the merchant is who buys it. And we're also starting to see the rise of the artist as an important figure in the late Gothic and early Renaissance world, and we start really knowing artists' names. Have you noticed that we really weren't talking too much about artists' names until the last 2 lectures, and the tail end of the Gothic period, we start having giants of art like Cimabue and Giotto, and we're going to study them in a little bit more depth in a little bit.